Frank Sinatra famously sang of New York City, "If I can make it there, I'll make it anywhere," and many an enterprising wrestling outfit has gone to the 5 boroughs in search of an audience. For generations, the McMahon dynasty has called Manhattan's Madison Square Garden home, and the world's most famous arena has played host to some of the most important sights and calls in their empire's history. But in 1994, somebody else was looking to host their own garden party, and they were far from welcome guests. More than 10 years prior, Vincent Kennedy McMahon began the national expansion of the World Wrestling Federation. In the fall of 1983, the Northeastern Territory began promoting shows in Ohio, which ruffled the feathers of presiding wrestler/booker Ole Anderson. Late that year, the WWF took over St. Louis, and right after the holidays they ran Detroit for the first time. In 1984, the outward expansion only continued. Minneapolis, Memphis, Chicago, Atlanta, and others hosted their first WWF events that year, while the incumbent promoters were powerless to do a thing. The widening scope of WWF flavor and the loss of top regional stars to the McMahon juggernaut laid waste to the long-standing territory system. Other than McMahon's thriving empire, only the Crockett/Turner entity we know best as World Championship Wrestling was anything resembling formidable come the 90s. Though painted sometimes dismissively as Southern fried redneck wrestling, Jim Crockett Promotions began making their own forays into the Northeast, probably figuring it was adapt or die. In 1985, Crockett ran Philadelphia, first through joint shows with the AWA before making the Civic Center a monthly stop all their own. Later that year, Crockett and AWA ran Baltimore together a handful of times, and the following year, Baltimore became a staple of Crockett's touring loop, the site of many a future Great American Bash. In 1990, the company began maneuvering toward the New York market with stops at the Meadowlands in East Rutherford, New Jersey, which some promotional material would try to pass off as New York, but that's just not the case. Reception for WCW in the shadows of the Big Apple was mixed, to say the least. Sometimes the full-sized arena would draw between 6,000 and 8,000 fans, while an August 1991 house show was attended by a dismal 1,800 spectators just days after WWE tore down the Garden with SummerSlam. There was only one king of New York when it came to professional wrestling, and the crown wasn't fitting WCW's head. But they still tried for adjacency to the throne. After last running the Meadowlands in March 1992, WCW didn't return to the arena for over a year. When they returned, they weren't content to just sit on the outskirts, they made their way into the city. On Wednesday, April 14th, 1993, WCW ran Madison Square Garden. Well, sort of. The wrestling didn't take place in the main room, but rather in the building within the building known as the Paramount Theater, or today the Hulu Theater. If you remember Ken Shamrock and Owen Hart's Lions Den match from the 1998 SummerSlam, or watched any NFL draft between 1995 and 2004, you've definitely seen this venue. In the days of classic WWF, the monthly garden shows would not only sell out the 20,000 plus seat main arena, but an additional 4,000 or so fans would pay to watch the event on closed circuit from inside the Paramount, which was then known as the Felt Forum. For WCW, selling out the 20,000 seat garden may well have been the impossible dream, but it was actually much worse for them. They couldn't even sell out the Paramount. Only 2,900 fans paid to get into the 4,500 seat theater, and freebies bumped the attendance up to about 3,500. And those who did show up got a wrestling experience that they'd likely prefer to forget. For one thing, Ric Flair was advertised for an interview segment but was unable to appear due to legitimate transportation problems. Immediately after souring the crowd with the announcement of the Nature Boys no-show, a match pitting Ron Simmons and Chris Benoit ended in a sudden and inexplicable no contest due to both wrestlers somehow violating company rules. After that strange audible was called from backstage, the event continued on and got a little better, marred only somewhat by vociferous booing towards several mid-card babyfaces such as Van Hammer and Marcus Bagwell. The house show drew $47,000 at the gate, but as Dave Meltzer would write, those figures for New York can't be considered successful, especially with the track record of NWA and WCW over the years in the New York market, which has shown significant drop every time in return business. More than a year later, however, the complexion of WCW had drastically changed. In the spring of 1994, Eric Bischoff managed to wrangle the single biggest star in the history of the wrestling industry, Hulk Hogan. After bringing the Hulkster into the fold on a financially loaded deal, he immediately positioned Hogan as the face of the company, putting him over Ric Flair for the world title at the 1994 Bash at the Beach. The event did an estimated 225,000 buys, the highest for any WCW event to that point. 6 weeks later, a Hogan-Flair rematch at the Clash of the Champions on TBS drew over 4.1 million viewers, a then record for any wrestling match on cable. Things were a little less rosy up in New York, where Hogan had once made a lot of money for a lot of people. At the time of 40-year-old Hulk's WCW debut, the WWF had begun its New Generation campaign, laughably equating Hogan to Ivan Putski and the Iron Sheik in terms of being antiquated. And the timing of the shade thrown at Hogan was far from coincidental. But WCW, they had a hot ticket in Hogan. After greatly reducing the house show schedule to virtual nothingness in late 1993 as a means of saving money, Bischoff now had a star the caliber of Hulk to open doors for the company. The first 2 weeks of September 94, Hogan and Flair headlined a WCW tour of Europe with mixed results. While shows in the UK, including one at London's Wembley Arena, only drew around 2,000 people, they were getting upwards of 7,000 or 8,000 in venues in Switzerland and Germany. Clearly, not everybody found Hogan to be a washed-up dinosaur. Stateside, for the remainder of 1994, Hogan was tasked with headlining a number of ambitious house shows scheduled for venues sizable enough to accommodate the WWF at their peak. Instead of settling for the secondary buildings in major cities as they once had, WCW booked Chicago's Rosemont Horizon, Minneapolis's Target Center, Oakland Coliseum, and Orlando's Arena, not to mention Detroit's Joe Louis Arena for the Halloween Havoc pay-per-view, with Hogan in the familiar role of star attraction. But the grand poobah of this zealous bit of touring was scheduled for Saturday, November 26, 1994. On that date, WCW would run New York's Madison Square Garden, not the Internal Theater, the Big Enchilada itself. This was certainly stirring news. On November 14, 1960, promoters Jack Pfeffer, Pedro Martinez, and Cola Quariani booked a show at the Garden for 12,000 fans, headlined by Bruno Sammartino going to a draw with Antonino Rocca. That was the last time one or more promoters not surnamed McMahon booked a wrestling event inside Madison Square Garden's primary arena, and 34 years later, somebody was fixing to end that streak. In August 1994, with Hogan's world title reign now in full swing, WCW booked the legendary venue with tentative plans to run Hogan vs. Flair on top. Around the same time as the announcement, the regular tenants of the building, the WWF, held a Thursday night house show inside the Garden just prior to SummerSlam. It drew a ghastly crowd of only 4,300, main evented by Bret Hart and Razor Ramon, taking on Owen Hart and Jim Neidhart. There was no telling how Hogan vs. Flair would do at the Garden, especially since the WWF promotional machine wasn't behind this endeavor. The last time Hogan wrestled in the building was March 1992, where he and Flair were on opposite sides of a tag team match that included respective partners Roddy Piper and Sid Justice, and that drew a Monday night crowd of 9,000. 4 months earlier, on Saturday, November 30th, 1991, a Hogan vs. Flair singles match took place inside MSG before a strong crowd of over 15,000. Close to 3 years to that day, they were fixing to lock horns inside those hallowed halls once more, one-on-one for the big gold belt. So, how many fans did WCW actually draw for Hogan vs. Flair for the WCW World Heavyweight title center stage inside the world's most famous arena in what looked for all the world to be WCW's triumphant return to New York City? What was the attendance for this monumental spectacle? Well, the attendance was 0. That's because within 2 weeks of the announcement that WCW was running the Garden, MSG suddenly cancelled the event and granted the November 26th date to the long-residing World Wrestling Federation. As it turns out, Madison Square Garden was in the midst of an ownership change at the time WCW requested the date for the event, and whoever granted their request was unaware of one fundamental fact. The World Wrestling Federation had right of first refusal for any and all wrestling events that took place inside the main arena itself. If WCW wanted to book Marcus Bagwell to get booed out of the rinky-dink theatre nestled inside the Garden, that was their prerogative. But WWF had it in writing that they could keep any wrestling promotion from holding events inside the Garden's primary arena. They were exercising their right of first refusal, and thus WCW was aced out. For WCW, this was understandably a bitter pill to swallow. A year after cutting back on house shows because there were such money losers, Hogan vs. Flair inside the Garden was fixing to be a pretty big payday for a company on an apparent upswing. WCW reportedly considered running the Meadowlands 11 miles away on the same night in opposition, but that just never materialized. In fact, the entire weekend for WCW ended up being reconfigured. Hogan had only agreed to work certain weekends per the terms of his cushy contract, and this was one of the few he was on the hook for. In the end, the champ wound up not wrestling at all. Saturday night was out, as was a Thursday Thanksgiving night card at Atlanta's Omni due to poor ticket sales. That too was to have featured Hogan vs. Flair. Also scrapped was a card on Friday night in Baltimore. Instead, WCW ran a Friday night card for 2,000 fans in Albany, Georgia, and a Saturday show in Dothan, Alabama in front of 1,100 fans. Not exactly big city numbers. WCW didn't run New York City again until June of 1996, returning to the same Paramount Theatre they'd patronized 3 years earlier. By this time, WCW Monday Nitro had begun its weekly pasting of WWF Raw thanks to a slicker, more vibrant product and the intrigue of Scott Hall and Kevin Nash showing up to make waves. This time around, WCW drew close to 3,600 paid for the theatre, and the overall attendance was near capacity at 4,500. Garden legends Bruno Sammartino and Pedro Morales made guest appearances, and the fans were treated to matches such as Chris Benoit vs. Eddie Guerrero, Steven Regal vs. Dean Malenko, and Randy Savage vs. Ric Flair. Aside from an awkward moment in which Conan cursed out fans for chanting ECW-related insults at him, the second New York go-around was considered a success. Perhaps exorcising a few demons from the 1993 fiasco, as well as the 1994 cancellation. And what of that WWF house show that ran in the Garden on November 26, 1994 instead? Well, it drew only 7,300 fans, which has to be a bit disheartening, seeing as it came just 3 days following Survivor Series. It is, however, a pretty notable event, seeing as it was the night in which Diesel defeated Bob Backlund in 8 seconds to kick off his one-year reign as WWF champion. Originally, though, it was to have been a much different match. When tickets went on sale for the WWF card, Bret Hart was the reigning champion and was advertised as defending the title against Backlund. The title switch at Survivor Series, along with Hart selling an injury as a result of that match, meant that Diesel got slotted in order to plow through Backlund in Hart's place. But that wasn't the match's most curious substitution. 3 weeks before the Garden show, a special referee was advertised locally for the world title match, Macho Man Randy Savage. And then, just days after that was announced, the news broke. Savage had left WWF for WCW due in part to his frustration at not being used often enough as an active wrestler. He followed Hogan's footprints south to Atlanta, and all locally aired promos hyping up Savage as the guest referee were quickly scrapped. A week after Savage was to have presumably countered Backlund's shoulders down in New York, Hogan's frenemy was making his first appearance on WCW Saturday night. WCW may have missed out on the one-night windfall of running Hogan and Flair inside the Garden thanks to WWF putting up the stop sign, but you must admit, gaining the Macho Man is one hell of a consolation prize.